It is a pleasure to continue our New York Center speaker series this afternoon. And welcome to everyone who's here and to everyone who's dialed in on the telephone. The mission of East West Institute is to reduce international conflict. We build trust where it is absent, facilitating dialogues that address seemingly intractable problems. We develop creative new solutions that we put into action via our global network of decision makers. Our original analysis and thought leadership is essential to this process. In that spirit, our speaker series is intended to help our donors, friends, and network around the world gain insights into and deeper understanding beyond the headlines into today's issues and conflicts, as well as to present new thinking and stimulate constructive conversation. It is my privilege today to present Khalid Malik, recently retired director of the Human Development Report Office of the United Nations Development Progamme. Since you have Khalid's biography, I will summarize only briefly the highlights of his very distinguished career. At the United Nations, Khalid held key leadership positions involving China, Uzbekistan, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Prior to joining the UN, he conducted research, including postgraduate at Oxford University, and also at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics in Islamabad. He holds master's degrees in economics from Essex University and Cambridge University, and a BA in economics and statistics from Punjab University. Khalid will help us understand some of the factors that are driving the violent extremism of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the various splinter groups that have grown in number, evident in the most recent terrorist attacks in France, which left 17 people dead and riveted worldwide attention. Khalid will discuss how a scarcity of resources like food and water, as well as development issues such as jobs and education, are driving the appeal and recruitment of these extremist groups. He will speak for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for questions. We are videotaping this program today, and it will be posted to the East West Institute website. So without further ado, Khalid, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Jim and others to invite me. Jim had proposed that I talk about extremism, and I kind of, I think foolishly said yes. We had done a global human development report in 2014, which is on vulnerability, and that did take into account violence issues. And I must admit, ever since he mentioned that, I started thinking and reading about it a little bit more. And I am hoping that the exchange would benefit me as much as the talk would raise questions for all of us. You know, it's immediately when you talk about, let me talk about violence and extremism, to take the two issues together and try to raise some issues of context. Where are we on it? If you look at the numbers, what is clear is that the death toll or damage from extremism or violent terror activities, quote unquote, very loosely defined, has been mostly in developing countries. And I think estimates vary, it's either 99% or 98%, but certainly large percentage of people who are hurt, displaced, are in developing countries. If you just go back a little bit and see the impact it's had on people, by the end of 2012, around 45 million people were forcibly displaced due to conflict or persecution, which is the highest in 18 years. And about 16 million of them became refugees. And of course, when something like this happens, it has many knock-down consequences, and I'll come back to some of those issues. But I just want to give you some contextual numbers first. The interesting thing is that internal conflict issues have been gradually going down. Interstate conflict issue has also been going down, but the non-state issues have been going up. So there's something going on which we need to understand more fully. And when we were trying to dig into some of these issues for the 2014 report, I would like to encourage you to look at the 2014 report. It's on vulnerability, of course, covers a much broader issue, but it tries to understand what are the root causes. And they are, as of course all of you know quite well, a lot of debates going on. What are the basic, what is defining this? Why is this happening? Now maybe, are we reporting it better? Is it really happening? You know, all these things come up because the perception certainly is that things are getting worse, not better. Huh? And there's one big debate going on I'm sure among all the security experts is that, is it a consequence of systemic factors, demography, policies, exclusion, huh? Or is it a clash of civilization, East-West issues, Islam versus believers, unbelievers? Is that, and you know, there are strong proponents on both sides. I mean, people claim that, of course, when the 9/11 thing happened, there was mostly young people from Saudi Arabia, mostly well-educated, mostly people from middle-class backgrounds. So it's not a poverty issue. Huh? That's their way of doing. You contrast that with the view that, well, if you look at why the 60s were so charged in the US, a lot of it was due to demography. There were just more younger people out moving around in the streets, trying to form their own identities and moving forward. So in the report, we try to highlight some of the interrelated aspects. And it's fascinating to try to dig into some of these issues, and I hope people have more questions on that. But just to highlight the challenges in front of us, Africa is about 1 billion people now. By 2050, it'll be 2 billion people. A large percentage of them under 25. And that has a huge set of implications as to what does it mean for change. When we looked at the Arab Spring, we tried to dig into deeper issues connected to the Arab Spring. And why is it that the Arab Spring happened mostly in countries which were doing quite well economically and socially, high human development countries? Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen is a bit of an outlier there. And I think when you dug into this and look at the evidence, it's mostly because when people get more educated, become much more aware of their sense of rights and their expectations go up. The relationship between the citizen and the state changes. They expect more from the state. They expect to have better, decent jobs. And if you add this phenomenon of social media, they are aware of what's happening all over the world. So they are much more aware of what their rights are, huh? What a human being needs and demands. And when you look at the numbers, you'll be surprised that, or should not be surprised that the gap where the job gap was the greatest is exactly where this Arab Spring was the most intense. So we had young, educated people who come into the labor market, could not find jobs, and therefore, when you know what's happening around the world and through social media techniques, you start demanding. You are more empowered in a way. You demand more. Huh? So demography is quite a big factor. Numbers matter considerably. I was reading somewhere that there was also this debate going on that, well, 99% of the Muslims are peaceful, but there's 1% which is not, and 1% of 1.2, 1.3 billion people is a lot of people. Huh? Actually, these are very kind of superficial arguments, actually. They're kind of off-the-cuff, big picture statements which you can agree, you can disagree, but you do not know whether it adds any real value to a conversation. When we started, I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 things in particular. One is exclusion. This is what I was beginning to touch upon. I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm going to talk about jobs. But there's a framework which kind of unites all of these issues. And some years ago, one of my predecessors, Mahbubul Haq, a very famous economist, who joined me with Amartya Sen, essentially thought about human development, drove it intellectually, coined the phrase human security. And human security had 2 parts of it: freedom from want and freedom from fear. And freedom from one is the issues of poverty and access to nutrition and all those things connected to it. But freedom of fear is very important. Feeling secure in your neighborhood, feeling secure in the community or society you belong to. Amartya Sen and I were doing a joint event some years ago in Hong Kong. And he did something interesting. He showed some data on homicides and basically showed that Calcutta, which is a poor city, right, has one of the lowest homicide rates in the world, even lower than Tokyo. So the question is why? And when you dig into it, many factors come into play. In Calcutta, partly because it had a Communist Party municipal government, they invested heavily in education. So rich people, poor people were going collectively to the same educational opportunities. Public transport, again, rich people, poor people sharing public transport. Communities were not segregated. So you had very rich households and squatter settlements next to each other. So you didn't have gated communities. And the thesis was, Amartya's thesis was that collectively, this made the difference. So this is one of the reasons why. So it's not only a function of income, that's clear. It's not only a function of education, but there are other things when people, economists, including myself, we talk about issues of social capital and social cohesion. It's something which is a bit difficult to measure, but there's something of value there. So under this kind of broad rubric of human security, what we have tried to highlight in the 2014 report is that these transitions which are important. And there are some sensitive transitions. One sensitive transition is of 0 to 3 years, children, small child. And you'll be surprised, longitudinal studies, 70-year-long studies, show that you can actually predict heart disease in adults over 60 from the way they were treated, nurtured, nutrition from 0 to 3 period. So it's so important. Yet most budgets in the world do not invest in that first period of life. Apart from a few countries like Sweden, most budgets are little in the beginning, grow up, and then of course grow as people get older. So there's something not quite right there. The other transition which is important are when people are trying to form their identity, younger people, youths. And you'll be amazed how radically different that is depending on the society you live in. So you live in certain Latin American societies, crime levels are extremely high. Even though education is relatively high, income is relatively high compared to other countries. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is to give you a sense that it's a little bit more complicated than these one-liner statements which kind of throw things off. At the same time, we also dug into a little bit on the issue of Syria, and maybe Nisha, and Syria was fascinating because, of course, you see the visible parts of Syria now. Once a conflict unfolds, many other factors come into play, and which we see it now. But some of the things which led to the conflict was actually a drought, which went from 2002 for about 4 years of severe drought, which basically impoverished about 2 million of the 8 million farmers, threw them out of their farms into urban areas, and where they did not have jobs, so there were no social support systems there. And there was this proletariat almost, but of a different kind, was ripe for a lot of other movements, whether it's pro-government, anti-government, or Islamic, or all these things were in play. So if you look at Europe, for instance, I read a very interesting article recently where in France, I think the perception of younger people is very high. All the survey data which shows that Muslims, particularly non-Africans who are in France, do not feel part of the community. So the social capital is relatively low. Social cohesion is limited. This is the issue of self-identity also, opportunities for progress. And exclusion then creates like demography. So if you have exclusion plus demographic forces coming together, becomes a very robust cauldron of expectations which can be directed one way or the other. So the Syria thing was, of course, got more complicated when the civil war started because of all what the neighboring states' positions were. I think Kofi Annan, as you remember, he was special envoy at the beginning, left very soon afterwards, and I thought he had done an extraordinary job in Kenya, where he actually helped the Kenyan nations reconnect and become whole again. Said something to me. He said that the difference between Kenya and Syria was that the neighbors were not involved. And that was a decisive issue. So the neighbors meant that everyone, superpowers included, had a position or a stake or in fueling conflict one way or the other, sending arms, money. So the real issue is that you have these systemic factors which are in play, with joining other issues. I mean, of course, systemic factors on their own may not produce certain things, but certainly coming together, they do. There was a survey done of the Taliban in Pakistan a few years ago and asked, why are the young people joining the Taliban? This is the Pakistani Taliban, not the Afghan Taliban. And the answer was over 70% of the young people were there for jobs, simply jobs. And if you look at the madrasas, the madrasa do something which the school system does not. They actually pay parents to send the kids to school. So that's a huge incentive, and they cover all the expenses of the children while they're at school. Huh? And what I've tried to encourage the Pakistan government as well is that one of the decisive things they can do is simply pay parents to come to school. I think that will be a huge step forward. Huh? So my argument has always been that these are linked issues: education, jobs, social media, demography. When the things come together positively, many good things happen. When they don't, not so good things occur. Huh? So there are no simple explanation of extremism as to why something happens, why it doesn't happen. Huh? Another factor I should mention, which may go against the point I'm making, is, everyone knows this, but the Saudis have been responsible for a lot of things. What is happening with Islamic countries now. I was the UN representative in Uzbekistan in the early 90s. And they, even at that time, this is 93, 94, 95, they were heavily investing in just sending money for mosques, for schools. And I remember having conversation with the president, who's not a great fan of human rights, saying that, look, if he does not control them, these guys will go out of hand. And of course, since I had a mandate from the UN, I was trying to argue that, look, treating people well is also a plus. If you treat people badly, there's some reaction which happens there. But if you trace the money flows from the Saudis and some of the Gulf states to many of these countries, you can see that 20 years ago, when these things first started, and even earlier than 20 years, it really has intensified. Essentially created, as did Ziaul Haq in Pakistan, created a theocracy in Islam which never existed. Theocracy is not meant to happen in Islam. But he created theocracy and paid them. So they were dependent on funder or a state, depending who was providing that. Another part of that same question was, so if you, just to complete that thought, if you disrupt the money flows, this is how the Elam Liberation Front or the Tigers in Sri Lanka finally were defeated. Because the Congress in the US essentially declared them as a terrorist organization, cut off their financing sources, and the diaspora could no longer send money, and gradually after a while, money matters. Money matters whether it's to do with jihadist elements. Money matters whether it's to do with civil wars as well. I should also be Pakistan. I should talk about India as well. People, when you talk to the security supremos in Pakistan, Minister of Interior and others, and they talk about, I've been encouraging a track 2 initiative between India and Pakistan to start talking and settling things. And unfortunately, the one I encouraged, I wasn't unable to next month, actually next week in Delhi. And if you talk to the security people in Pakistan, they have absolutely clear in their mind that the Indians are up in Balochistan, which is probably true. And that, of course, the army and all kind of issues come into play. But the reality is that in India, something like 1/10 to 1/4, estimates vary, of municipalities in India, think of the scale of India. 1/10 to 1/4 the number of municipalities are experiencing a civil war situation. I mean, think of it, 1.2 billion people. And we talked a little bit about that in the report as well. Because people have, when what they call horizontal inequalities, when groups of people realize that they're not benefiting as much as others, and if that continues over time, at some point they also react to it and either take up arms, or the Naxalites, or the Maoist movement, or whichever you call it, is remarkably widespread. So if you look at the numbers, it's actually much Pakistan. So, I mean, people, because it's being in play, as it were. And the reason, social services. It's a very simple reason. Not having enough access to education, not a perception of not being able to move ahead as a community, as a group, has led led those groups to then take up arms and fight for the rights. The same is true what happened in the Philippines in terms of the Muslim groups who were, and actually, if you look at the Muslims in India, their education status, the income status, the health status is much lower than the non-Muslims in India. Actually, it's the converse in Pakistan. In Pakistan, to be a non-Muslim is not a good idea, because again, your status is much lower than the others. So it does matter how you perceive yourself as a human being, what rights you have as an individual, and how you form part of your own community, and whether your community is prospering or not. So you cannot separate these broader issues from looking at why people take up arms to fight for their rights. And it is, if you then reduce it down to the Islamic extremism issue, what is amazing for me is the sheer investments which have been made for killing people, for degrading assets, as they call it, and the lack of investment in the more enduring aspects of things. Take Afghanistan. At the height of the investments in Afghanistan, there were something like $200 billion of the international community which was spending money on both war and other. $200 billion is a lot of money. There's 40 million plus people in Afghanistan. You can literally send everyone for advanced studies anywhere in the world. And when John Meadows, who's your departed leader, was a dear friend, when we had a lot of conversation on it, my argument always was that if you make some investments in opening up trade and exchange links between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and neighbors generally, and drive development that way, it's actually a low-cost way of increasing jobs. It's a low-cost way of making money. pouring money through the international relief or development or army effort is a very expensive way of doing business. And I'll give you examples, including, since I'm retired from UNDP, I can say these things. UNDP itself now is handling about $1 billion a year, every year in Afghanistan. We're spending $1 billion a year. 1/5 of our entire resources globally. And when you look at the numbers and see who is being employed, you realize that most of the money is not going to the Afghans. It's actually going to foreign experts in different guises, security. First you need to get foreign experts, then you need security services to protect the foreign experts. But in the end, development will not happen unless local leaders, local institutions, and the citizens themselves make a commitment for change or move forward. And so anything dealing with Afghanistan is complex. Many years ago when I was UN representative, I actually a mini conflict between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. And I learned my lessons at that point, which is don't trust anyone when you're doing these negotiations, very complex. However, the reality is that if you can invest money in the right way, create jobs, public relief programs, trade links, you are creating the conditions for sustained peace. And actually, there's no other way of doing it. And if you add education and tolerance and other things and cutting off money supplies, at the same time, you have to also expect state security services to be robust in their response. I think what has happened in Pakistan is that this drift has gone on for so long that it became part of the local culture in Pakistan, that people just accepted thresholds of uncertainty and terror which would not have happened in the past. And where the elites in Pakistan, elites in Pakistan still are unreconstructed elites. They're not fully constructed. They are still very much connected to the land ownership issues, and even those who are in industry are connected to the land ownership matters. So I think when the recent thing happened in Peshawar, it pushed the whole society to take a firm view. And I was looking also at some of the surveys done on attitudes towards terror and violence. And actually, where things are the worst, the percentages go up very high in rejecting violence. Pakistan was 85% last year. By now, I think it's probably over 90%. People who do not believe in violence, who do not think the religion sanctions violence, those kind of things. But what has happened is that over the last, since the first wave of Taliban, in the last 20 plus years, we've allowed these groups to become narco states, to become states within states, and they cannot survive without money coming from somewhere. And everyone knows where the money is coming from, but very reluctant to change it. So it needs a certain amount of commitment by an elite to run things in a certain way, and that will only happen if the incentives for them, for their own longevity, change. If they get a view that, if they have a feeling that they have to do this now to survive as an elite, then that it changes. Otherwise, very difficult to change behavior. I'll stop at this point. I'm sure I've created a lot of questions which I'm happy to interact with you, so I can also learn from your collective experience.